The early morning of April 24, 1974, shattered the silence of their apartment in Bad Godesberg, with the crash of doors being forced open. CHRISTEL Guillaume awoke at 6:32 a.m. to the faces of German Federal Criminal Police agents inches from hers. Her first reaction wasn't surprise, it was relief. 18 years of living a lie were coming to an end. Beside her, her husband Günther uttered the only words that mattered. "I am a citizen and officer of the German Democratic Republic. I ask that you respect that." The couple's son, 17-year-old Pierre, watched in astonishment as his parents were handcuffed and taken from their home. Only days later would he discover the truth. His parents were Stasi spies. The Guillaume's arrest triggered one of the biggest espionage scandals in West German history during the Cold War. 2 weeks later, Chancellor Willy Brandt, Nobel Peace Prize winner, architect of Ostpolitik, symbol of reconciliation between East and West, resigned. The world was shaken. How had an ordinary woman, secretary, mother, trusted neighbor, penetrated the core of Western power? It was 1956. Europe was still bleeding from the wounds of World War II, but a new war had already begun. Silent, fought in the shadows, without visible battlefields. The Iron Curtain divided the continent not only territorially, but also ideologically, morally, and humanly. On one side, Western democracies were rebuilding under the Marshall Plan and the protection of NATO. On the other, the Soviet Union was consolidating its empire through rigidly controlled satellite states. Germany was the most brutal symbol of this division. Berlin, which years later would be cut in half by a wall of concrete and barbed wire, represented the abyss between two worlds that despised and feared each other. In this context, espionage was not just a tool, it was war itself. While nuclear arsenals maintained a balance of terror, secret agents were the true weapons, infiltrated into governments, corporations, universities, and churches. Every stolen document, every recorded conversation, every revealed secret could shift the balance of power between nations. For the German Democratic Republic, the communist regime established in the Soviet occupation zone, espionage was a matter of survival. Surrounded by enemies, economically fragile, and politically illegitimate in the eyes of many Germans, the GDR depended on its security apparatus, the dreaded Stasi, to stay afloat. CHRISTEL Ingeborg Margarete Meerrettig was born on October 6, 1927, in Allenstein, East Prussia, today Olsztyn, Poland. The illegitimate daughter of Erna Meerrettig, a farm worker, CHRISTEL grew up marked by the social stigma that accompanied children born out of wedlock in conservative Germany. In the early 1930s, her mother married Tobias Boom, a successful Dutchman who ran a tobacco factory in East Prussia. Boom adopted CHRISTEL and pledged to give her a solid education. The family moved to Leisnig, and for the first time in her life, CHRISTEL experienced some stability. But European history would not forgive this brief peace. In 1940, when Nazi Germany invaded the Netherlands, Tobias Boom was arrested in Nuremberg on charges of being a hostile alien. He was released, but imprisonment destroyed him physically and mentally. In 1944, Boom died, leaving CHRISTEL and her mother alone amidst the chaos of war. Young CHRISTEL, who dreamed of becoming a medical assistant, saw her aspirations evaporate with the end of the war in 1945. Without the resources to complete her studies, she had to reinvent herself. She learned typing and shorthand through private lessons, essential skills for a woman who needed to survive in a devastated Germany. With limited job prospects in Leisnig, CHRISTEL moved to East Berlin and found work as a secretary at the Committee of Peace Fighters, a front organization for the communist regime. It was there in 1950 that she met Günther Guillaume, a photographer for a publishing house. The relationship progressed rapidly. They became engaged within a few months and married on May 12, 1951 in Leisnig. After a period living with Günther's mother, the couple received an apartment in Lennitz, about 35 kilometers northwest of Berlin. CHRISTEL's mother, Erna, joined them in 1953. Life seemed to finally return to normal, but CHRISTEL and Günther were no ordinary couple. Both had been recruited by the Stasi. On the surface, they were just two more GDR citizens trying to build a life. In the shadows, they were agents in training for the most important mission of their lives, to infiltrate the heart of West Germany. In the early 1950s, while Günther made short trips to the west for the Stasi, the couple received intensive training from the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, HVA, the Stasi's foreign intelligence arm. The espionage school in Belzig was considered the best in the communist world. There, CHRISTEL and Günther learned techniques for clandestine survival, how to construct false identities, how to communicate through codes, how to identify and avoid counter-espionage, how to live two lives simultaneously without ever confusing one with the other. CHRISTEL's recruitment was no accident. The Stasi had identified valuable attributes in her: discreet intelligence, secretarial skills, resilience developed through years of hardship, and above all, the fact that her mother had settled in Frankfurt, West Germany, and opened a tobacconist's shop. This family connection would be the key to the couple's natural entry into the West. In May 1956, the order arrived. CHRISTEL and Günther, accompanied by CHRISTEL's mother, crossed the border and arrived in Frankfurt am Main, presenting themselves as refugees from the communist regime. The facade was perfect. A young couple with family connections in the West, fleeing the oppression of the East. No one would suspect that they were the eyes and ears of Markus Wolf, the legendary head of the HVA, known as the Faceless Man, the master spy of the century. CHRISTEL opened a cafe in Frankfurt, establishing herself as an ordinary, hardworking, discreet citizen. In September 1957, she joined the Social Democratic Party of Germany, the SPD. It was the beginning of an infiltration that would last 18 years and change the course of German political history. The mission was launched. The Invisible Woman began her journey. The transformation of CHRISTEL Boom into CHRISTEL Guillaume, a Stasi agent, was not the product of coercion or manipulation. It was a deliberate ideological choice, born from the ashes of Nazi Germany and nurtured by the promise of a better world. To understand this choice, one must understand the context. CHRISTEL grew up under Nazism, saw her adoptive father, a Dutchman, destroyed by Hitler's war machine, witnessed the devastation of war, and, after 1945, found herself in a Germany divided between two opposing systems. In the Soviet zone where she lived, the Communist Party presented itself as the only genuine bulwark against the resurgence of fascism. This narrative resonated deeply with someone who had lost so much to Nazism. When the Stasi recruited her, CHRISTEL didn't see betrayal. She saw duty. Her husband Günther was already involved with East German intelligence. The proposal was clear: infiltrate the SPD, gather information on Western policies, and serve socialism against the forces that allegedly conspired to resurrect German militarism. The training in Belzig was brutal and transformative. CHRISTEL learned that an effective spy is not dramatic or daring, she is invisible. The HVA taught its agents to be perfectly ordinary, to blend so completely into society that no one would ever notice them. CHRISTEL practiced the art of total concealment. She learned to encode messages using methods that appeared to be innocent correspondence. She trained to recognize surveillance and evade it. She memorized procedures for contacting other agents, meetings in public places, discreet signals, deliveries of material through third parties. The Stasi used shortwave radio transmissions, known as numerical radio messages, to communicate with its agents in the field. CHRISTEL and Günther were given personal codes. She would be Heinze, he, Hansen, and birthdays and other personal events were incorporated into the coded transmissions to boost the morale of the operatives. But the most crucial training was psychological. CHRISTEL had to learn to live two lives simultaneously, without one contaminating the other. During the day, she would be the devoted wife, the efficient secretary, the friendly neighbor, the committed member of the SPD. At night, when the curtains were drawn, she would be Heinze, relaying information to East Berlin, planning her next move, keeping the double identity alive. In May 1956, CHRISTEL, Günther, and CHRISTEL's mother, Erna, arrived in Frankfurt am Main. Erna's presence, having already settled in the city and opened a tobacconist's shop, was essential to the couple's credibility. They presented themselves as genuine refugees fleeing the oppressive regime of the GDR. The Western authorities, accustomed to the constant flow of East Germans seeking freedom in the West, had no reason to suspect them. CHRISTEL and Günther went through the bureaucratic procedures, received documentation, and were integrated into Western society. The first task was to establish themselves economically and socially. CHRISTEL opened the cafe, a modest but respectable business that would give her both cover and access to people. Günther began working as a photographer and quickly became involved in the activities of the local SPD. The Stasi's plan was long-term. They did not expect immediate results, but a slow, patient infiltration that would eventually place their agents in positions of trust within the party. In September 1957, following instructions transmitted via radio, CHRISTEL joined the SPD. She began working as a volunteer, then as an employee of the party newspaper Der Sozialdemokrat. Her competence, discretion, and dedication did not go unnoticed. CHRISTEL was the type of person every organization needs: reliable, hard-working, with no apparent ambitions for prominence. In 1960, CHRISTEL landed a job that would change everything: secretary in the office of Willy Birkelbach, a member of parliament for the SPD. Later, when Birkelbach was promoted to advisor to the governor of the state of Hesse, CHRISTEL went with him. Suddenly, she had access to sensitive documents, including NATO strategies. As a trusted secretary, she saw everything, copied everything, transmitted everything. The documents were passed on to Günther, who delivered them to Stasi contacts. Meanwhile, Günther was also advancing. He became a paid district secretary for the SPD and a member of the Frankfurt City Council in 1968. He was seen as a reliable, meticulous party official with no political aspirations of his own. Exactly the persona the Stasi had cultivated. But the personal price of this double life was high. CHRISTEL and Günther had a son, Pierre, 2 years after arriving in the West in 1958. Pierre grew up like any other West German child, knowing nothing about his parents' true identities. Every night, CHRISTEL would put him to bed, then sit at the kitchen table and transcribe secret documents. Each of Pierre's birthdays was marked by coded messages from the Stasi, invisible to the boy but laden with meaning for his parents. Loneliness was overwhelming. CHRISTEL couldn't trust anyone but Günther. She couldn't have genuine friendships because any slip could reveal her true identity. She couldn't express doubts or fears because, in a spy's life, hesitation is betrayal. She lived in a psychological prison where every word, every gesture, every facial expression had to be carefully calibrated. And there was the moral dilemma. CHRISTEL genuinely believed she was serving the cause of peace. The Cold War narrative, seen from East Berlin, was one of legitimate self-defense against Western imperialism and German rearmament, but at the same time, she saw the prosperity of West Germany, freedom of expression, the dynamism of democracy. These contradictions couldn't be easily reconciled, so CHRISTEL did what all spies do. She compartmentalized. Her ideological beliefs were kept separate from the realities she observed daily. In 1969, the moment the Stasi had been waiting for finally arrived. Willy Brandt, leader of the SPD, was elected Chancellor of West Germany. It was the first time in 40 years that a center-left government had come to power. Brandt promised a new policy, Ostpolitik, the normalization of relations with East Germany and the Soviet Union. For the Stasi, it was crucial to monitor Brandt closely. Was his policy genuine or a ruse? Günther Guillaume, on the recommendation of Georg Leber, a labor leader and member of the SPD, was offered the position of junior advisor in the Chancellor's office. In 1972, he was promoted to Brandt's personal advisor. CHRISTEL continued her own trajectory, now even more important as the wife of the man who had direct access to the leader of West Germany. The transformation was complete. The girl from Allenstein, who had lost everything in the war, now walked the corridors of power. But the weight of that double life was beginning to crack the foundations. Between 1969 and 1974, Günther Guillaume became one of the Stasi's most well-placed sources in West Germany. But CHRISTEL remained essential to the operation. While Günther was in the spotlight, relatively speaking, since his strength was precisely his ability to be discreet, CHRISTEL operated on the periphery, processing information, serving as backup, maintaining impeccable domestic cover. Günther had an office 1 floor above Chancellor Brandt. He was described by colleagues as nothing. You'd find him there like you'd find a chair in a room. This calculated insignificance was his greatest asset. He accompanied Brandt on trips, including to Norway. He had access to diplomatic bags, confidential correspondence, and negotiation strategies. Secret NATO documents, including letters from President Nixon on nuclear strategy, passed through Guillaume's hands before being delivered to Stasi contacts in Sweden and other clandestine meeting points. CHRISTEL knew every detail of these operations. She helped code reports, prepared material for broadcast, and maintained her home in Bad Godesberg as a fortress of bourgeois normalcy. Neighbors saw her as an ordinary housewife. while classified documents were photographed in her kitchen. The primary mission was to monitor Brandt's Ostpolitik. For the GDR leadership under Erich Honecker, Brandt's rapprochement policy was ambivalent. On the one hand, it legitimized the GDR internationally and could bring economic benefits. On the other, Brandt was immensely popular in East Germany, a symbol of hope for family and national reunification. This popularity represented a threat to the regime. Guillaume's reports focused less on military secrets and more on the mood of the government, the internal tensions of the SPD, and the true intentions behind Ostpolitik. Between 1969 and April 1974, Guillaume sent 23 reports to East Berlin. Ironically, the Stasi considered the quality of the material only moderate. Guillaume did not have access to war plans or deep nuclear secrets. Its value was political and strategic, not military. But in espionage, even seemingly mundane information can have catastrophic consequences. Brandt was negotiating sensitive treaties with the Soviet Union and Poland. Any leak regarding their negotiating positions could completely undermine their diplomatic strategy. In 1973, the net began to close. The Federal Agency for the Protection of the Constitution, West Germany's counterintelligence service, intercepted coded Stasi messages on shortwave radio transmissions. Agents noticed strange patterns. The transmissions included dates that coincided with Guillaume's birthdays and those of his family members. These personal messages, intended to boost the morale of agents in the field, became their undoing. Suspicions about Guillaume were not new. As early as 1955, there were reports questioning his past. When he was proposed for a position in Brandt's office in 1969, new red flags were raised, but the reports were lost in bureaucracy, filed away and forgotten, a fundamental flaw in the Western system. Now, in 1973, the evidence was solid enough. Günther Nollau, head of the federal agency, recommended to Brandt that the Guillaumes be kept in place and placed under discreet surveillance. It was a calculated decision. Better to monitor a known spy than to alert him and lose track of the entire network. Brandt agreed, even knowing the risk. He even took Guillaume on private vacations, maintaining the appearance of normalcy. CHRISTEL and Günther sensed the surveillance. They were too professional not to notice the signs. Cars that appeared repeatedly, familiar faces in unexpected places. East Berlin instructed them to suspend all intelligence activities. The decision to flee or remain was left in their hands. They chose to stay. Perhaps they believed the surveillance was merely routine precaution. Perhaps they felt that fleeing would confirm their suspicions. Perhaps after 18 years living in the West, the idea of returning to East Germany was too daunting. CHRISTEL's moral dilemma intensified during this period. She had dedicated her adult life to serving East Germany, convinced she was building a better world. But now, with the surveillance tightening, her teenage son unaware of the danger, she faced the possibility of imprisonment, trial, and separation from everything she knew. There were moments, in the quiet hours of the early morning, when CHRISTEL wondered if it had been worth it. She had helped bring down Willy Brandt, a man who genuinely sought peace and reconciliation, the very goal she claimed to serve. The irony was cruel. The Stasi never wanted Brandt's downfall. Markus Wolf, the head of the HVA, would later admit that Brandt's resignation was one of the greatest ironies of fate, and one of the Stasi's biggest mistakes. For years they had planned measures against Brandt, and now when they really wanted him to remain in office, the Guillaume scandal would force him out. But at that moment, in 1973 and early 1974, CHRISTEL didn't know that. She was simply living with the growing horror of knowing that the end was near, powerless to prevent it. The tension at home was becoming palpable. Pierre, now 17, sensed that something was wrong, but his parents couldn't explain it. Every knock on the door, every unexpected phone call, made CHRISTEL's heart race. And then, in the early morning of April 24, 1974, at 6:32 a.m., Operation Tango was executed. The doors were broken down. The agents stormed the apartment. CHRISTEL and Günther were arrested. The life they had built, the mission they had served, the identity they had maintained for 18 years, it all crumbled in an instant. The only thing that remained was the stark truth. Günther uttered the words that sealed his fate. "I am a citizen and officer of the German Democratic Republic. I ask that you respect that." There was no denial, no lies. After 18 years of living a charade, there was a strange relief in finally telling the truth. CHRISTEL said nothing. She simply watched her son, Pierre, standing in the hallway, his world crumbling before his eyes. In that moment, all the ideological justifications, all the Cold War rhetoric, all the grandeur of the mission evaporated. All that remained was a mother who had betrayed not only a country, but also her own son. The arrest of the Guillaume brothers detonated a political bomb in West Germany. On May 6, 1974, 2 weeks after the arrest, Willy Brandt resigned as Chancellor. Officially, he cited the Guillaume affair as the reason. Unofficially, there were other pressures. Rumors of extramarital affairs, tensions within the SPD, political fatigue. But the Guillaume affair was the last straw. How could a chancellor remain in office when his personal advisor was an enemy spy? Brandt's resignation was a tragedy. He had won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1971 for his Ostpolitik. He was a statesman genuinely committed to reconciliation. His downfall represented not only a victory for Western counterintelligence, but a defeat for the policy of détente. Helmut Schmidt, his successor, adopted a tougher stance against the Soviet Union, supporting the deployment of nuclear missiles on German soil. East-West relations worsened. The irony was bitter. The Stasi had destroyed precisely the leader who most benefited its interests. The West German public was shocked. How had a spy penetrated so deeply into the government? Where were the security services? The failures were glaring. There had been suspicions about Guillaume since 1955, but the reports were lost in the bureaucracy. The system had failed spectacularly. For CHRISTEL, the arrest marked the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. She and Günther were held in separate custody while investigations continued. In June 1975, they were brought to trial in Düsseldorf on charges of high treason. The trial was a media spectacle. Günther was sentenced to 13 years in prison. CHRISTEL received 8 years, plus 5 years of loss of civil rights and the right to vote. The sentences reflected the gravity of the crime but also the perceived difference in roles. Günther as the main agent, CHRISTEL as an accomplice. But those who knew the operation knew that CHRISTEL was not just an accomplice. She was an integral part of the entire mission. During the trial, devastating details emerged. It was revealed that Günther had been a member of the Nazi Party, something he had never told CHRISTEL. For her, whose Dutch adoptive father had been destroyed by the Nazis, this revelation was a profound betrayal. All the ideological justifications that underpinned her participation in espionage, fighting against the resurgence of fascism, now seemed empty. How could she have dedicated her life to a man and a cause that concealed this truth? The imprisonment was brutal. CHRISTEL spent 7 years in a Western prison. They were years of isolation, forced reflection, and growing remorse. She constantly thought of Pierre, who had been pressured by the GDR authorities to move to East Germany. Pierre, hoping his parents would be quickly released in a prisoner exchange, agreed. But the exchange did not come quickly. Pierre spent years in the GDR, a young Westerner trying to adapt to an inflexible system he neither understood nor loved. He desperately missed his parents. He felt betrayed by them and by the state for which they had worked. In March 1981, the exchange finally came. CHRISTEL was released as part of a prisoner exchange. 6 Western spies for her. Günther was released in October of the same year, in a separate exchange. Back in East Germany, they were received as heroes. They received East Germany's highest honor, the Order of Karl Marx. CHRISTEL was promoted to lieutenant colonel in the Stasi and returned to work at the intelligence service headquarters in East Berlin. But there was no joy in returning. CHRISTEL divorced Günther almost immediately. The reasons were multiple. His confession during the trial, which she saw as a betrayal of an agent's principles, the revelation of his Nazi past, and simply the collapse of any illusion of love or trust after years of tension. The divorce was finalized in December 1981. CHRISTEL reverted to using her maiden name, Boom. Life in East Germany after returning was strange and displaced. CHRISTEL had spent 25 years in the West. Despite everything, she had grown accustomed to the relative prosperity, freedom of movement, and social dynamism of West Germany. Returning to the austerity and rigidity of East Germany was a shock. She was given a special, secure residence in Hohen-Neuendorf near Berlin, a privilege reserved for important figures. But material privileges did not compensate for the emotional emptiness. Pierre was also in East Germany, but the relationship between mother and son was irreparably damaged. Pierre would later write a book, Der fremde Vater, The Strange Father, exploring his complicated relationship with Günther. He would also participate in a 2004 documentary, Schattenvater, Shadow Fathers, along with Matthias Brandt, Willy Brandt's son, both reflecting on their childhoods and the devastating legacy of the Cold War on families. The human cost of espionage was not abstract. It was etched on the faces of children betrayed by parents who had chosen ideology over family. CHRISTEL worked for the Stasi until 1989, when the fall of the Berlin Wall and subsequent German reunification rendered everything irrelevant. The regime for which she had risked everything crumbled overnight. East Germany, which she had believed she was defending, proved unsustainable. The masses she thought she was protecting rejected the system wholesale. The narrative that had sustained her entire life, that socialism was the future, that the West was the enemy, that her espionage served peace, evaporated. CHRISTEL retired and moved to West Berlin after reunification. The choice was significant. She did not remain in the former East. She lived discreetly, an anonymous old woman in a city she no longer recognized. In February 2001, she lost a lawsuit against the German government, in which she requested that the 7 years she spent in prison be added to her pension. The request was denied. Until the end, she remained invisible, unrecognized, uncompensated. CHRISTEL Boom died of heart failure on March 20, 2004 in Berlin. She was 76 years old. Her death went almost unnoticed. There were no official tributes, no dramatic headlines, no public homages. The woman who had helped overthrow a German chancellor, who had served as one of the most highly positioned spies of the Cold War, died in obscurity. Günther Guillaume survived her by 6 years, dying on April 10, 2010 at the age of 73. He spent his last years writing memoirs, giving occasional interviews, trying to justify his life. CHRISTEL, by contrast, remained silent. In the 23 years between her release from prison and her death, she rarely spoke publicly about her life as a spy. This silence was perhaps her final statement. But the Guillaume case left deep marks on German history and on the history of international espionage. Willy Brandt's resignation in 1974 changed the course of European politics. Schmidt, his successor, abandoned some of the conciliatory Ostpolitik and adopted positions more aligned with NATO. Trust between East and West deteriorated. The 1980s would see an intensification of the arms race and a new wave of nuclear tension. Only in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall, would the cycle be broken. The impact of the Guillaume case was also profound within the intelligence services. In the West, it triggered a complete overhaul of security screening procedures. How had someone with a suspicious past dating back to 1955 managed to get so close to the Chancellor? Bureaucratic flaws were recognized and corrected. New protocols were established. The lesson was brutal but clear. Complacency kills. In the East, the assessment was more ambivalent. Markus Wolf, the head of the HVA, would later admit that the Guillaume case was a strategic mistake. Yes, they had managed to plant an agent in the heart of the Western government. Yes, they had collected valuable information. But at what cost? Brandt's downfall precisely damaged the policy that most favored the GDR. Ostpolitik had brought international recognition, economic benefits, and legitimacy to the communist regime. Schmidt, although also in favor of détente, was much more cautious and pro-NATO. The Guillaume scandal, therefore, represented a tactical victory but a strategic defeat. Wolf would write in his memoirs that Operation Guillaume exemplified the dangers of espionage. Sometimes obtaining information can cause more harm than good. After German reunification in 1990, Stasi files were gradually declassified and opened to the public. Researchers were finally able to examine the full extent of East Germany's espionage operations. What they discovered was astonishing. The Stasi had infiltrated virtually every institution in West Germany: parliament, businesses, universities, churches, the media. Guillaume was no exception, but rather part of a vast network. Among the declassified documents were the 23 reports that Guillaume had sent to East Berlin between 1969 and 1974. Historians who examined them were surprised. The quality of the material was good but not exceptional. Guillaume did not have access to detailed nuclear plans or secret military strategies. His reports focused on internal politics, cabinet moods, tensions within the SPD, and Brandt's positions in negotiations. Valuable information, certainly, but not the kind of secret that would justify the risk and cost of the operation. This discovery has generated debate among historians and intelligence experts. Some argue that the Guillaume case was overemphasized, that its real impact was limited. Others argue that espionage is not just about secret documents, but about understanding mindsets, predicting political movements, and influencing decisions through advanced knowledge. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. Guillaume and CHRISTEL were competent operatives who provided useful information, but their importance was amplified by the political scandal they caused. The most important legacy of the Guillaume case, however, lies not in the documents or the immediate political consequences. It lies in the human and moral questions it raises. CHRISTEL Boom dedicated her adult life to serving an ideology. She genuinely believed she was building a better world, fighting fascism, promoting peace, defending socialism. But in doing so, she betrayed the country that had taken her in, lied to her son for 18 years, and contributed to the downfall of a leader who genuinely sought reconciliation. When she finally confronted the consequences of her actions, imprisonment, divorce, exile, and ultimately the complete collapse of the system she had served, what remained? CHRISTEL and Günther's son, Pierre Guillaume, spent decades trying to understand his parents. In his book Der Fremde Vater and the documentary Schattenväter, he explored the wounds that espionage had inflicted on his life. Pierre grew up believing his parents were ordinary citizens. The revelation that they were spies shattered his understanding of identity and family. He was forced to move to East Germany, a foreign country where he felt alienated. When he finally reunited with his parents after their release, he discovered he didn't really know them. The person he thought was his father was a construct, a persona fabricated by the Stasi. Who was the real man behind the mask? Pierre never got a satisfactory answer. Günther tried to explain, justify, contextualize. But how do you explain to a child that you chose ideology over truth, mission over family? In 2004, when Schattenväter was filmed, Pierre appeared alongside Matthias Brandt, Willy Brandt's son. The two men, on opposite sides of the Guillaume affair, shared their experiences. Matthias spoke about growing up as the son of a public figure, about the trauma of his father's resignation, about how the Guillaume scandal had tainted his childhood. Pierre spoke about discovering that his parents were spies, about being torn from his life in the West, about the alienation he felt in East Germany. The two stories, though different, shared a common theme. Children always pay for the sins of their parents. The Cold War wasn't fought only between superpowers. It was fought in living rooms, at family dinners, in the fragmented identities of ordinary people. CHRISTEL Boom's legacy, therefore, is complex and contradictory. On the one hand, she was a competent spy who served her cause with dedication and courage. She lived 18 years in disguise, risked her freedom and family, endured imprisonment and exile. On the other hand, she served an oppressive regime, helped overthrow a leader who sought peace, and betrayed not only a country, but also her own son. How should we judge her? There is no easy answer. The history of the Cold War is full of morally ambiguous characters, people who made terrible choices for reasons that, in their minds, seemed justified. CHRISTEL believed she was fighting fascism and promoting peace, but her actions contributed to tension, mistrust, and polarization. This contradiction cannot be resolved. It can only be acknowledged. In the years since her death, CHRISTEL Boom has rarely been remembered. Unlike other famous Cold War spies, such as Melita Norwood in Britain or the women of the Cambridge Ring, she has not become an object of cultural fascination. There are no films about her, no popular novels, no extensive academic tributes. She remains, as she was throughout her career, invisible. But perhaps that invisibility is her true legacy. CHRISTEL's life reminds us that espionage is not glamorous or romantic. It is lonely, morally ambiguous, and humanly destructive. Real spies are not action movie heroes. They are ordinary people making extraordinarily difficult choices, living with lies, sacrificing relationships, and often ending their lives questioning whether it was worth it. For women in particular, the story of CHRISTEL Boom offers painful lessons. During the Cold War, female spies were often made invisible, seen as assistants to men, when in fact they were operatives just as competent and dedicated as their male counterparts. CHRISTEL was not merely Günther Guillaume's wife. She was a Stasi agent in her own right, with training, missions, and responsibilities. But in the public narrative, she always appears as a supporting character. Even her prison sentence was shorter than Günther's, reflecting a perception that her role was secondary. This invisibility of women in the history of espionage is a pattern that has only recently begun to be corrected. Today, historians recognize that women like Crystal were fundamental to intelligence operations. Their ability to go unnoticed, to be seen as just secretaries or just wives, was precisely what made them effective. The irony is cruel. Crystal was invisible because she was a woman, and this invisibility made her a formidable spy. But in the end, that same invisibility erased her story. What remains then of Crystal Boom's life? A story of difficult choices, devastating consequences, and irresolvable moral ambiguity. The reminder that ideologies, no matter how noble they may seem, can lead us to betray not only countries, but also the people we love. The understanding that the Cold War was fought not only between superpowers but within families, within consciences, within hearts divided between loyalty and truth. When Crystal died in 2004, the world was already completely different from the one she had lived most of her life in. The Soviet Union no longer existed. East Germany was just a memory. The Berlin Wall was reduced to fragments sold as tourist souvenirs. The Cold War, that conflict that had defined her existence and justified her sacrifices, was now just history. And Crystal, the invisible woman who had penetrated the heart of Western power, was just another elderly Berliner who died in an ordinary hospital. No headlines, no tributes, no ceremony, just silence. But her silence speaks. It tells us that espionage has a cost, not just political or strategic, but profoundly human. It reminds us that behind every secret operation, every stolen document, every overthrown government, there are real people with real lives, real families, real consciences. It challenges us to think about loyalty, betrayal, courage, and consequence. Crystal Boom's story offers no easy answers. She is neither a heroine nor a villain. She is human, terribly, inescapably human. And perhaps that is, in the end, what makes her story so important. It reminds us that the Cold War wasn't just about abstract ideologies or geopolitical rivalries. It was about people like Crystal, ordinary people pushed by extraordinary circumstances to make impossible choices, to live unsustainable lives, to sacrifice everything for causes that in the end proved not worth the human cost demanded. This really happened. A woman named Crystal Boom lived 2 lives for 18 years, served an ideology with absolute dedication, helped to overthrow a German chancellor, spent 7 years in prison, divorced, went into exile, and died alone in a reunified Berlin that no longer had a place for her. This really happened. And the fact that it happened, that it's not fiction but documented history, is what makes Crystal Boom's story not only fascinating, but essential. She is a mirror in which we can see the real costs of ideological warfare, the permanent scars of division, and the uncomfortable truth that sometimes the people who make history are the ones who later disappear from it, invisible until the end.